Welcome. I'm Jess Walter, Director of Be Civic. Thanks for joining us today for this important conversation, The Big Headline. I know we all get a ton of news every single day of our lives, and we've also experienced how it can be both really impactful in a positive way and really impactful in a negative way. So I'm really excited that we have two amazing leaders here today to share with you, frankly, all of their expertise, I hope.
We're here for you.
Yeah, around the big headline, the good and the bad. And if you don't know these amazing folks, I have the pleasure of introducing you to them. And I do have to give a shout out. Both of their organizations have been with Be Civic since the beginning, before my time, and they are founding Be Civic members. So they've always been huge advocates for this work, and we're excited to bring them to the table today. Because I know they're such amazing people, I do need some notes on them. But I'd first like to welcome Corey Streetman. She's Barefoot PR's co-founder and chief executive in charge of making the dream work. Such a good line. She's been learning through life experience since she left home to travel the world at 19, leading into her knack for relating to and understanding people. I really feel that. Her sense of adventure has also led her to build a company where heart is valued alongside expertise. Corey manages Barefoot PR's operations and leads the team in turning strategy into reality. She is cool under pressure. She is a skilled at navigating difficult situations and is an expert matchmaker, helping clients connect purpose with passion. Corey continues to travel the world with her husband, Tyler, and two kiddos, Brayden and Jacob. And if you don't know who Barefoot PR is, they are a fabulous organization based right here in Denver. They are skilled in everything from media relations, messaging, digital engagement, content creation, crisis communications, CSR, visual storytelling, and they really are just a team of communicators. Yeah. And then my pleasure of introducing Gil, who I recently got to meet. He is the Vice President of GroundFloor Media. Gil brings more than 2 decades of experience to the table. He translates his expert counsel, or he translates this talent into expert counsel for all of his clients, particularly in the areas of crisis communications, issues management, public issue campaigns. When it comes to his clients and their issues, he's helped them navigate class action lawsuits, government investigations, employee issues, community and legislative issues. So, true expert in our hands. And I know we're going to learn a lot from him today. And prior to joining GroundFloor, Gil was deputy editor on the business and metro desks at Rocky Mountain News. He's also a Colorado native, which I know is kind of rare these days. And if you don't know who GroundFloor Media is, they execute integrated communications programs for all of their clients with national and global reach. So,
All right.
pass this over to you.
Well, I think I'm going to stand for this. I don't have to awkwardly fidget in my chair. Good morning. Hi, familiar faces. My team is here, some of them. So thank you for being here. All right. So when Jess asked us to participate in this conversation and wanted me to talk about kind of this idea of positive media relations, positive PR, really for me, it all comes down to storytelling. And this is a quote that we always start our storytelling presentations with, and legend has it that it is a quote Mr. Rogers always kept in his wallet. And it's, frankly, there isn't anyone who couldn't learn to love you. There isn't anyone you couldn't learn to love once you've heard their story. And this to us really kind of drives home the reason why we do what we do. Storytelling is so important, and storytelling can be such a powerful force behind making connections in the world. You know, so often especially in the CSR world, we're so focused on those impact numbers, the data, which is really, really important. But we oftentimes forget that you have to kind of wrap that into a story to make a connection. Research shows, and if Sarah, my other half, was here with me, she would tell you what that research is, but she just tells me there's research. So research shows that people make that connection. Brains, there's science behind it, really connect with the story, and even more so than data and numbers. And so we, as storytellers, know the importance of kind of wrapping all those pieces together when we're trying to get people to connect with a message. So really fast. A story, I think whenever I think of this slide, I always think of my dad because the man can tell stories for hours upon end, but never really understand what the purpose is behind it. Love him to death, but in our world of PR, stories need to have purpose, and that's where a formula is really helpful. And this is one that our team uses often. And I would tell you that probably most PR agencies, PR professionals have some version of this formula that they use on a day-to-day basis. So for us, the first piece is the picture. And we think about an artist painting a picture. And this is the literal images, the what happened, the who was there, the details that kind of collect the picture, right? So it's before you get to have that purpose behind it, but it's all of those details that we think about. Next up is promise. And this is where you really get more into the benefits versus features. The features are really more the picture. The benefits of the story formula is the promise. So at the end of the day, when you're thinking about who you want to connect with, you need to think about what matters to them. People care about what impacts them, what matters to them. What problem is this story essentially trying to solve in the world? So when you combine that with the picture, you're kind of moving towards that purposeful storytelling. And then lastly is the proof. And this is the data that a lot of you all in the CSR world are probably more familiar with. But again, without these first two pieces, the story isn't really complete and you aren't really making that connection with people. So before you start venturing out into getting that word out there into the press or in various platforms, you need to think about the whole story and how you're going to position it. So picture plus, wow, that's a lot of proof. Picture plus promise plus proof is the formula, but at the end of the day, all these things won't really matter until you put a really nice frame around it. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But before we get to the framing, I want to talk about audiences a little bit because audiences are also really important. When you're thinking about that headline and how you want the story to land, it really matters who you're trying to get in front of. So again, stories are just words and pictures without an audience to actually receive them and connect with them. So these are just a handful. I don't need to walk through all of them, but for those of you in the CSR world, there's some really specific audiences that we care about, right? And for each company, there's going to be a different one that's a priority. And what you need to start to think about is you've got these pieces of the storytelling formula, but then coming up next, you got to think about the frame that you put it in and which frame is going to connect with the audience you care about the most. So frames for us, we always are really intentional about them. So you can tell a story, the exact same story can be told through different frames, and the point of view is different. It lands with a different audience in a different way. So for those of you who have more of a background in PR, this is more traditional kind of what makes a story newsworthy, but we also apply this to what makes a story stick, what makes a story interesting, relatable, connect with your audience. So some things to think about, what is that impact? Lead with the impact. The story isn't going to land unless somebody can really understand that impact behind it. Prominence is another one, timeliness. The how-to angle I also think is really interesting. So for example, to kind of bring this to life, if you have a CSR program, instead of just saying we did blah, we donated X number of things, blah, right? Yeah, that's great. Yay. That's great. However, if you lead in with that around, well, this is how we created this program. This is how we applied the resources we had access to. This is how we engaged the volunteers. And this is ultimately the impact that it had, right? So that is going to be a more impactful story and people like to connect with that. The milestone one I also think is really interesting in CSR because I think oftentimes CSR folks, we set goals for the impact that we want to have in the world or the amount of money we want to raise, the amount of people we want to influence, the number of employees we want to engage in the program. It's really interesting when you can tell milestone stories, right? So if you can share out like, we hit this milestone, but we're not done yet, we're going to hit another milestone. The next one, values and culture. This is a huge one in CSR. So much of CSR is based on a company's values and culture and being built off of what you believe in as an institution. So if there's a way for you to tell your story, but frame it through the values and culture of the company, you're going to connect a lot better with, especially with your employees, potential employees for recruitment. your investors, whoever that might be, but really showing that there is a connection there and that really furthers the authenticity of the story. So going through this quickly, this is another piece. So when we're getting more into that, the headline idea. So people always want to have this like big flashy headline. We did this. This is great. The story should be all about us. But what we always want to tell people is you just don't want to be a one-hit wonder, right? Like it's great to have that one big headline, but it's even better if you can give that story life over a longer period of time. So some ways that we do that is we build what we call editorial calendars. News people know what that is. We apply it in PR. So we have our clients tell us the kinds of stories that they care about most, or the milestones that they're working to hit, or the programs or the timeline, how the program is going to be fleshed out over the course of a year. We build an editorial calendar that allows us to make sure that you're always part of an ongoing story. And you can tap into things that are timely, connect with current events, times of year, whatever it might be. The other piece here is to use stories more than once. You know, I mentioned this idea of one story in different frames can give it life for all different audiences. Balancing big stories and small ones. You know, you don't always have to have the big headline. I know that's the title of today's presentation, but sometimes you can be the small subheadline. Sometimes you can just be a mention in the story, and it's just as important because it's all about frequency. Planning for an entire year. You know, again, it's great to be the headline, but it's also great to be an expert in something and know that the media is going to call you to talk about this issue that you had a big headline about in January, but maybe you can provide some quotes throughout the year on what they're covering, or there's just ways to fit into the ongoing life of that story. Using storytelling to advocate for your programs with partners and influencers. You know, so often we think that PR is just about media, but it's not, right? It's about making sure you're connecting with those audiences on all different levels and through all different platforms. So how can you advocate for your programs in presentations like this one, or partnering with Be Civic or chambers or other organizations, getting in front of audiences and actually telling them what you're doing and not just worrying about the media piece of it. And then don't forget to share your story with your staff, because they can be great advocates for you, but you need to give them the information and kind of allow them to take it from there and kind of use their own words to tell the stories. Okay, so last slide. Some final things from my sort of proactive PR side to think about. When it comes to audiences, remember from a CSR standpoint that the inside is just as important as the outside. You know, so often when we ask our clients, why do you want to do PR for your CSR? They say, well, we want the media to care about us. And it's like, okay, we want to attract talent. And it's like, great, but don't forget to talk to people inside the company as well, because you need both of those things to make an impact. Don't forget to check back in and continue the story. Just because it lands once doesn't mean it's done. Don't forget to leverage all the platforms. Like I said, the news media is one thing, but today everyone is a citizen journalist in some capacity. Don't forget about the platforms you own, because people are paying attention to them. And then lastly, don't forget to integrate your message and your story across your brand. This is a big one for me, especially. You know, I think authenticity is so important, especially in CSR. You know, if you're doing this thing and you're talking about it and it's a great program and it's made an impact in the community, but if somebody pulls back the curtain and sees what's happening at the company is not in alignment, nobody's going to believe in it. So you need to make sure that what you're doing is integrated across. And that's not as easy as it sounds. And I recognize that there is work behind that, but you need to make a conscious effort as a CSR storyteller to talk to the different departments and explain how are you integrating what we're doing on CSR and community investment into everything that we're doing. And maybe it's just they don't have the words for it. So how can you give them those words and those resources? So that's my piece. Handing it to Gil. Thanks, guys.
She took about like half of my presentation. It's going to be similar. So when we talk about, no, that's great, because proactive PR and crisis PR, it's pretty similar. We talk about authenticity, we talk about audiences, we talk about you know, good stories. So that's great. That was a good intro. Okay, so when I was a cub reporter in Aspen, Colorado, after I graduated, there was it was a 2 newspaper town, and it still is a 2 newspaper town. And there was the other newspaper, the Aspen Daily News. I worked for the Aspen Times, and the Aspen Daily News, they had their motto was, if you don't want it printed, don't let it happen. And that was their motto, and it's still their motto today, and it still resonates. And so what has changed from then, that was, many decades ago when I was a reporter, there are fewer reporters, and so it's harder for them to find out if it happens, but more often than not they do. So so crisis communication and reputation management, what is it? So we break it up into 3 buckets. First bucket is preparing for a crisis. So it's not if, it's when. And so when you think about it, there are a lot of things that happen that are outside of your control. So let's say COVID, that's a great example, right? So that's potentially a crisis. It's not a crisis for like the big headline, it could be, but it's a crisis for your company and for communications and for your customers. And so when we talked about those audiences, that list of audiences is the exact same list of audiences that I would use here when we have I've got a slide that say know your audiences. Just remember what she put on that slide, because that's the same thing. So it used to be that media was the top of that list. They're not anymore. It's just changed so much that you don't need the media to tell your story, and the media sometimes probably may or may not find out about your issue. But they're one of 12 things that you need, one of 12 audiences that you need to communicate with. So we always talk about preparing for a crisis. I don't know, how many of you have crisis communication plans right now? Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, those are good. Those are good to have. As an agency, we're putting together a crisis communication plan. So we're like the cobbler's kids, right? So we help all of our clients, but we don't have a plan for our agency, but we're working on a plan for our agency. So crisis communication plan, it's a communication plan. We talk about there's like a plan that you can put together that says, okay, you close the building. So it's an operational plan, but this is a really communication plan. Like, what do you communicate? What are the issues? And we identify what are the 5 things that could happen that you're worried about. So, for instance, one of the crisis communications plans we did were for the Denver Art Museum. And so we go through like, okay, so active shooter, right? So let's, what happens when that happens? Someone steals the artwork. What do you do, in that case? Who do you communicate to? So you think through like, okay, what keeps you up at night? What if happens? Data breaches. Everybody should be worried about a data breach these days, right? So we have the kind of preparing for a crisis, and with the idea that it's good karma. If you have a crisis communication plan and you continue to update it, maybe you won't have a crisis. So if you don't have a plan, you're probably going to have a crisis. So and then we get into managing a crisis. So it's always better when you're managing the crisis if you can say, oh, didn't we do a crisis communication plan? Let's go through that. Let's find that page that has the checklist. If you didn't, that's fine. We can still do it. So we kind of actively manage a crisis. And this can be kind of a low boil crisis, or it can be a full blown crisis. And so you think about, the awful shootings, those are, major crises where it's like, okay, it's all hands on deck. But like another crisis could be, we talked about the government investigations. And so those take a longer time, or if it's a lawsuit, every time the lawsuit pops up, it goes through the process, you have to manage it. And then there's the all important recovering from a crisis. So the crisis, after it kind of disappears, it's not gone. So if you Google your company and, the crisis is going to show up, because that's the way it is. And so what can you do to manage it? And what kind of messaging can you put out there, and what you kind of shift into the proactive to say, okay, we had some bad news that happened. Let's learn from it and let's move forward. So that's kind of the life cycle of a crisis, and we kind of jump in at different places depending on our clients. So these are the areas that we kind of work on, during a crisis. The one thing that we just want to bring up is that online war room. That's a social media simulator that we do it in-house. And so we simulate a crisis and like how it manifests on social media. And it's fast, and it just, you're just like, oh my goodness. Like, as you're thinking, well, what kind of response we have? It's like, oh my God, there's like 15 more tweets about this. So it just shows the immediacy of how you need to respond and how you get to have the approval. A lot of times for us in the room, for the PR professionals, it's not surprising. It's more surprising for your executives, where they're like, oh my goodness, this is what you guys do? How do you like manage it? So it's kind of bringing them on board with that. Recent crisis experience. So I had a long-term client, and she called up and she said, some union officials have showed up at one of our communities, and they put up a giant inflatable rat. And it's basically, it's like, what do we do? Oh my God, we're freaked out. Everybody sees this giant rat in front. And fortunately, that's not the first time that's happened. That's like the third time that the rat has shown up at one of my clients. And so it happens. The rat it's ubiquitous. It's ubiquitous. That's what the union does. If they don't like your practices, they come and they show up and they blow up the rat, and it gets all the attention. And I said, so the rat was around when I was a reporter. We never covered the rat. No one's going to cover the rat. It's just to get pressure, create some messaging, let people ask your questions. And so the point of that is, if it's happened, we've probably done something about it. These are just the ones that we've done recently, but if it, goes back, I didn't put the, union issues is up there. So just kind of an example of some of them we've done. Some of them are harder than others, clearly. So, okay, so if you don't want to print it, don't let it happen. So sometimes things happen, right? So something happens, and a lot of times it's outside of your control. And so it could be like a natural disaster, or it could be something that happened that, unfortunately it did happen. So how do you manage it when it does happen? So we talk about setting realistic goals and next steps. Let's do getting everybody in the room who is a decision maker and decide, okay, what do we want to accomplish? Making it disappear or spinning it is never a good thing. So that's like the buzzword for me. I don't know if you ever get that either. When someone says, we want to spin it. And I was like, that's like, to me, that's a red flag. And I don't spin. I just don't. That's not what we do. It doesn't work. So setting goals would be, an example would be to, let's try to get our side of the story out there. Let's try to add some balance to it. Knowing that you're never going to be the lead of the story. They're never going to say exactly what you said. They're never going to ignore the news. So that's setting those expectations up front, I think, are important. And then the next steps, identify the audiences. The only one that I think that we talked about that you had a whole slide on is your internal audience. And I think that's not number one. So if you have a crisis, you want to communicate with your team and your company first. And I think that's just the most important. All the others are equally, not equally important, but they're important. Just keep them. Just remember your internal audiences. Craft authentic messages. You use the word authentic, right? So they have to be real messages. They have to be real. And so you have something happen, and you can't just put out a statement to say, okay, we're sorry. It really has to be, what are you doing about it? That's always the thing. It's like, okay, you're sorry, but tell me how you're gonna do it. And people are forgiving if they see, like, okay, we get it. That happens. Most people are, they understand. So what are you doing about it? And they have to be real steps, and they can't just be like, oh, this is against it. We have everybody has their, HR rules. This is against our HR rules. And, I'm sorry it didn't happen. But we're doing training, retraining our staff because of this. We are, bringing in some experts to look at it. We're bringing in a third party to investigate it to make sure that this isn't a systemic issue. Identifying trained spokesperson. So your CEO, if they are good in front of the camera, or if they're good in interviews, that's, always the first option. As a reporter, I always hated talking to PR people about big issues. You can help me, you can help organize the issue, give me all the background, but for on the record, if it's a big issue, you want the top executive. Sometimes they're not awesome in front of the camera. So it's getting them trained if they can do it. If not, it's finding someone else that is a good spokesperson. hopefully you can do that before the crisis too. So you're not like, oh shit, what are we gonna do? Monitoring channels, that's just as important as, all of these is, where is this manifesting? So more often than not, it's going to be on social media. So you're going to see these issues blow up on social media. How is it blowing up? Who's sharing it? Is it, are there advocacy groups behind it pushing the issue? And then just, so once you understand that, you can help kind of respond to it and how you want to respond to it. There are some issues. We have a good example. We had a client who had some layoffs. And so we put together a crisis communication plan in anticipation of the layoffs. The layoffs happened. There was a tweet about it, like, hey, anybody heard about the layoffs at this company? And so we looked at it, and the client's like, okay, we gotta put out our statement. We gotta, start doing everything. So we took a look at that one tweet. It was an egg. It was an egg account, and it was just established like 3 days ago. And they didn't tag us, and no one was following them. So it's like, okay, so let's just wait and just see, how it bubbles up. On the flip side, we had another client that we brought in, we were in that towards the managing the crisis. We were like at the end stage of that, where there was literally a tweet a second about it, where it's just like, oh my God, I cannot breathe. There are so many tweets. It went viral nationally, internationally. So in that case, it's like, okay, we have to put out a statement, and it needs to be a real statement. So post responses on our appropriate channels. And so, you want to respond on Twitter if you can, or on Facebook, and if you want TikTok, you can do that as well. Just kind of being, going to where the conversations are and responding on those. And then the all important kind of, what works, after the crisis, like, has died down a little bit, to say, okay, what did we do well? What can we do better? Where were our gaps? I think that's equally as important as doing it on the front end, because you're learning from it. And I always tell this to my clients who are in the thick of this, that when you go through this, you are better for having gone through it, because you increase your team support. Who can do what. You have better communication, better internal communication. So you identify these audiences, and it just makes you a better, company for it. I was going to do just a quick case study for a company that we worked with. They are in the construction industry, and they had an unfortunate racial incident. So someone put up a noose in one of their warehouses, and so just a really, really unfortunate incident. But it happened. They called us in to say the community is really upset. They're going to protest. We've got the media calling. We don't know what to do. So I don't think they had a crisis communication. Yeah, you know what, they didn't. So we showed up, and it's like, we have to do more than just a statement. It's actions, not words. So fortunately, we were able to apologize, to say, you know what, this is not part of us. The executives were horrified by it, so when we get these calls, it's like, okay, do we want to take this on? It's a really nasty issue, and is it something that we can be effective with? And is it something that that we can work in partnership with the clients? And it turns out they were good people, and they were just like, this happened. And that gets to the idea that it's beyond your control. They don't manage the people in the warehouse, and so they're a parent company. So they apologized, and they said, okay, here's the 3 or 4 things that we're going to do. We're bringing in a DEI expert, and they're going to train our entire staff, and they're going to go through this training. We are going to make inroads to the communities. So there was some groups that were doing the protests. So they met with them one-on-one and sat down and say, okay, we understand that, this is a big issue for you, but we want to do better, and we want to make these inroads. And so they really worked behind the scenes, and they didn't add fuel to the narrative. They could have just done a statement and just kind of let the issue go, but they wanted to do more, and they looked at it as an opportunity to grow as a company. And then fast forward to 2 years later, they just got an award from the community that they for establishing inroads into the community and doing some things. They sponsored a Thanksgiving turkey giveaway. And they're, not just giving money, but they're giving their time and effort. And so it really turned that issue around. And I was thinking about what made that campaign so that exceeded all of our expectations. And what made that so effective was that the CEO was willing to roll up his sleeves and to do the work and to sit down. And I think one of the meetings that was with one of the Black Ministerial Alliance, he sat down and the first thing they did, they prayed. They sat down, let's you and I pray. And it was like, what CEO can do that? But this CEO could do it. And it was part of his values. And that's what made it so effective. And so that just gets to kind of the partnership that you have during these crises, just kind of like, okay, let's strip away everything and let's get the work done. Yeah, great. So we did QA.
I think so.
Thank you, Gil and Corey. I'm gonna get everything. I'd like to see you.
Are we still in the owl?
Felt very close. So I'm Amy Moynihan and I work with Gil at GroundFloor Media and CenterTable. And I'm also on the Beat Civic Programs Committee for several years with Jess. And thank you all for being here today. And thank you, Gil and Corey, for running through the big headline on the positive view and then crisis view. So I'm going to ask a few questions and then I'm going to open it up for you all if you have additional questions.
I know they're a little.
Oh goodness. So we'll ask you the first question on the positive news side of things. You talked a lot about different audiences.
Mm-hmm.
So can you share with us a little bit about how you maybe cross-pollinate a news story on some social channels or even in paid media to help kind of extend the life of that big headline?
Yeah, I definitely can. Before I even answer that, I was like really wanting to say this, that I loved everything that Gil said. And I wanted to clarify too how the two pieces, they are so important to work together because you have to create, we kind of call it like a buffer. Like if you go into a crisis without any positive, you're sort of starting from nothing. And so it's so important. So I just have to say that out loud. Okay. So back to how do you extend the life of the story? Yeah, I'm trying to think of a really good example done recently, but it's, again, it goes back to this idea of framing, right? So I'm gonna put it out to the audience. Does anyone have like a community event that they recently did, or a volunteer day, or a giveaway? Like, give me an example to use. Anybody got one?
We have our day of service.
I love your day of service. Yes. Okay, so day of service, great example. So I'm going to make up a lot of details here about this. So let's just say that the day of service, they had hundreds of employees coming. It was the biggest that's ever happened. They partnered with 17 nonprofits in the city. There's a lot of impact numbers there, right? There's a news angle to that, right? Like there's some really newsworthy components. So you can pitch stories to different media outlets. Awesome. But again, don't forget about your internal audience. So the way that I would frame it a little differently is your internal audience would probably be like, oh, yay, we had all of our people. Great. Numbers don't really mean as much to them. But what they want to see is Joe from accounting. He had this really impactful moment where he was working with someone, made this connection, realized that the kid that they were supporting, and I don't even know, doing a backpack of stuff for, knew one of his kids at school. That is a really impactful story that your employees want to hear about. And they say, wow, Joe from accounting had that experience. I want to do that next time, right? So different opportunity there. So then think about your social platforms. Social is a whole different animal. Visuals are really important. So we need to think about when you're on site doing the day of service, how can you capture really quick snippets? They don't need to be professionally done. They don't need to be 10 minutes long. Think about when you're scrolling through your social feeds. I don't watch videos for more than a couple seconds, right? So what kind of snippets can you capture that you can put on your social platforms and think about who you want to engage there? Other platforms to think about. If you have investors, right? So you want to put together a CSR report at the end of the year. You need to be thinking throughout the year what information you want to capture. So day of service is almost like culmination for you. That's your signature shining example, right? So think about how you're going to capture these different stories and how you want to present them in that report, whether it's online, PDF, printed, whatever it might be. Paid media is another interesting one. I mean, be thoughtful about it. Does it make sense to pull money from your budget for something like this? Paid media for us is really more when you're trying to get someone, an audience, to take an action. And I wouldn't necessarily invest a lot of paid money behind telling a CSR story because, I mean, it's not as authentic, right? Like when you see an ad, you remember a message maybe, but for me, it's not about taking an action. And so I would not do a ton of investment behind it. Now, another thing you could think about is if you have a nonprofit partner that you're engaged with, maybe put your money towards that. Pay for them to have an ad out into the world to support a campaign that they're working on. Sort of like shift the narrative a little bit. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yes.
Thank you for the example.
I really liked how, Gil and Corey have also like really driven home, like your employees are your number one stakeholder. And I don't know if anybody else watched or saw the purpose report from Carol Cohn. She did a webinar last week and everybody was like, your employees, it's where it's at. Like they're your ambassadors, they're your, voice in the community. And oftentimes they're forgotten or not number one on the list. They may be even 5 or 6. So I love that you guys are bringing that home. So Gil, you talked a
Why
lot
are you
about.
laughing? Why are you?
Well,
Give him a
What
good
is the
side.
question? She knows that when we do media training, I'm the angry reporter, so that she's getting me back.
We decided to play roles.
Well, I love we always talk about like being brought in the middle of the crisis, and so I think it goes back to that. Why is it important for that pre-planning? Like, why is it important to have a crisis plan? And one that's a little bit more actionable versus, a folder that's stuffed on a desk somewhere. So like, why should that be a priority for companies?
And that we always talk about that when we go in for these crises, if they have a crisis communication plan, it's probably not going to be too helpful. It's going to be, 200 pages and it's outdated. The crisis plans that we do are like 20 pages long. And if you don't read any of it, there's one page that has a checklist of things that you need to do. And so it just makes it so much easier. And it's like, okay, so we have the list of audiences, right? So one example is we have an owner for each of those audiences, like who's going to communicate to each of those audiences. And so, okay, so internal audience, you've got HR, so they're going to do that. Who's going to reach out to the regulators? Who's going to reach out to the community? And so if we just know that going into it, I think it's just so much better. And then we have that core messaging. So with some of the crisis, like particularly in heavily regulated industries, there's not much you can say. But if you have it already down before in your crisis communication plan, you have like here's a draft press release for this issue. It just gets you so much further ahead than trying to build it from scratch. And then we talk about that escalation chart. Those are important in crisis communication plan. Is it red, yellow, green? So green is like, okay, it's kind of bubbling. We had, let's say that layoff example, we had 1 tweet. So let's just kind of start monitoring more. Oh, we've got 5 tweets. They're starting to tag us. So it's getting to be yellow. Oh my goodness, we have, 50 tweets in the last hour. So now we are red. So for each escalation, you have like, okay, here's what we need to do. Oh, media trucks are showing up at the building. What are you going to do? So it just makes it so much easier to manage that. And it just, I love doing crisis communications plans because I just like figuring out like, okay, what's keeping you up at night? What are those issues? And so it just helps us get further ahead.
Well, kind of along those lines, what are some of the avoidable mistakes that folks do when they're maybe not thinking through planning? And for example, one of the things that comes to mind is like having your communications director or VP on vacation when a crisis hits and nobody has passwords to social channels.
No, that's a common mistake. It's like, oh my goodness, how do we respond on Twitter? The person who had it, she's gone and we never got it. So it's a common mistake. So I think some of the thing, I think that's it. I think it's memorializing where the passwords live, who's your backup. So you have your comms director, who's that person's backup? Okay, who's IT's backup? Like if we want to build we call it a response page that that responds or does a Q&A, you know, who's the backup if IT's not around? So just kind of building those stop gaps, I think are important.
Right, great. With the shrinking media landscape and constant moving of beats, we're seeing that even locally, where a lot of our tried and true reporters are no longer around or have gone off to do other things. How do you recommend building some positive media relationships with who's in our market?
My team's gonna love this, like, we talk about this all the time. There isn't one answer, but the way that I always approach it, and at our firm, we call it the behavioral approach. It's this idea of building actual friendships and actual relationships with people so that when they aren't leaving, they're gonna let you know, and they're gonna let you know who you should reach out to. And I think oftentimes with our clients, are like, oh, I'm scared, like, what do we do with them? They're not people. And it's like, no, they are human. Some are more challenging to work with than others, as I'm sure Bill can attest to. But you know, it's figuring out how you make the connections with them, right? It's reaching out and talking about what they wrote about, commenting on a story that they wrote about, not just reaching out and asking for something, right? Like we at our company, and I'm sure a lot of others too, we want to be resources for the media and not just ask for things from them all the time. It's sort of the same principle as the proactive PR. It's like building this trust with people over time, because you're right, like there's changes that are happening all the time. And we try to stay on top of it, but even, you know, it's our job to be on top of it, and we can't know all of it at all. It happens so quickly, but knowing that you always have an in and you always have someone you can reach out to and ask those questions. You know, our team, we try to have regular check-ins with reporters and editors, often taking them to coffee or just having a conversation, but also recognizing that they're really busy, right? So not being offended if we say, hey, can we go grab a cup of coffee to brainstorm? And they say, I can't, we're not going to take it personally, right? But continuing to send things their way. You know, I mean, a good example, I do this often just to kind of try and maintain relationships, and the three ladies back here can also attest to this. It's when I see a reporter is working on a story, like for example, one of the newer reporters, Denver Business Journal, was working on a couple of different stories on ADA compliance within the workplace. We have worked in that space a lot. We don't currently have clients that are doing that, but I reached out and said, hey, do you know these people? And it was no benefit to any of our clients, but it's just continuing to be that resource. And I understand that, you know, it's easier for us as PR professionals. This is our job all day long, but I would encourage all of you, if PR is even a remote, like a small piece of your job, just make a commitment to do it once every couple months, you know, or even once a month. You know, like just reach out and share a piece of information with someone that isn't just about asking for something in return.
Thank you. Yeah. All right, I'm going to open it up to see if we have any questions.
Yeah.
I have often loved the difference between marketing and PR being described as you telling your story and then getting somebody else to tell your story. And a lot of us struggle, I think, especially on social media, and we work with our nonprofit partners. I feel like I'm forcing ourselves on them. How do you get the nonprofits to tell your story, especially in the CSR space, rather than just you kind of barking at everybody out there, look how great I am?
Yeah, that's a great question.
So I'm gonna, so I need to repeat the question a little bit. Okay, so the question came across that, you know, how do you get your nonprofit partners to help tell your story? Because I think a lot of times it's, you don't want to go out as a company or organization and be like, look at how great we are, look what all we're doing. But you know, using your nonprofit partners to tell that, and sometimes that can be tricky as well. So
yeah, I'm happy to answer that. And there's not one answer, but some of the things that we've done in the past, you know, I think the first thing to remember is that you have to have that conversation on the front end, right? Go into it with this expectation of, hey, we want to tell your story, and how can we work together to reach each other's audiences? And it's not a requirement. I think that nonprofits, especially, so many nonprofits are used to like grants and requirements and feeling like they need to check the box. And so they're just kind of invested in the process. But if you are truly invested in forming a partnership with the nonprofit, there are ways that you can give them the information that they need. And sometimes it's a matter of they just don't know what you're okay with saying. So from the nonprofit perspective, they're worried they're going to say the wrong thing, or do you need to have like certain press releases or so, I mean, we are actually doing this with you right now. From the nonprofit side, you know, it's, hey, what are the things you want out of this as a corporate partner? And don't forget to say that. It's okay to say, these are certain things that we're hoping to get out of this from a partnership perspective. It's not a requirement, but how can we work together to give you what you need so that we can get that benefit? I mean, they're not, nonprofits are not like altruism. It's not real. It's not. I mean, like, we all want to do good things, but at the end of the day, you're a company and you have to be able to say back to your leadership, this is why we're doing this. Like, you have to show how it impacts the bottom line in some way. And nonprofits get that. They're just not going to be the ones to step up and do it, or like, they're not going to initiate it. And so some might, really sophisticated ones might, but for the most part, you need to come to them and say like, hey, can we have a conversation about it? What can we give you? We create toolkits oftentimes from the for-profit side to give to nonprofits, approved language, approved images, quotes, things like that. But it's, you know, you have to take some of that responsibility because the nonprofit is this much of their time is dedicated to that piece of it. So, you know, another piece too, we have been, when we are the PR partner for the for-profit side, we will sort of be given to the nonprofits and say, hey, you can access our PR team and they'll help you do some of this storytelling. And obviously we have the for-profit partner, the interest in mind. So that's been, you know, one other approach too. We've done that many times. So
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah. All right, we have time for one more question. Yeah.
So I work closely with our marketing and communications and PR team, but I'm not responsible for that piece. So I'm just curious, I've been thinking a lot about when there is a crisis for, let's say, a partner that you have, or something that's happening in the community, what goes into the decision making as to whether or not you are going to make a comment or a statement? I just think a lot about that, and thinking about Denver Scholarship Foundation and when we make comments about things and when we don't. And I'm not a part of those conversations, but I have been really curious about that recently. So for either of you.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it, you know, there are some times where less is more, right? And you just wanted like, okay, is this an issue that we want to do a comment? And I think you want to think about that comment, like, what is the comment? What is the value of the comment? Is it something that is going to advance the story? Is it something that is, you know, that it's helpful? So thinking through that and just like, you know what? And even in that case, like, who's the reporter? Like, is it is it one of the, you know, there's a handful of really good reporters in town. There's a handful of really shitty reporters in town. That it's just like, you know what? I don't Westward. I mean, if they're doing a story about you, it's probably, you can't, they just take such a negative sensational angle. And it's not your audience, right? Who's reading Westward these days? I mean, you know, it just doesn't make, it doesn't, are you reading it? Yeah. Sorry. So there's a lot of just thinking through those strategies of, you know, how does it make sense? If it's a good reporter and they're doing a bigger story, and even if it's uncomfortable to make a comment, it's probably, you know, you can do it. Just there's, you know, all those steps that you have to think through, and, you know, there's no right or wrong answer. I mean, sometimes it's like, oh man, I shouldn't have put them out there for the interview. With a crisis community, I'm less apt to put people in front of the camera. You know, it just doesn't make sense. Let's focus on our key audiences first, and instead of the media, and just kind of go that route.
yeah, I'll add to, you know, when you're thinking about more like a broader public statement, we've done like full training actually through BCivic on crafting authentic public statements. It's, you know, from being on the CSR side, do your best to be proactive in reaching out to your PR team and be like, hey, this is a social issue and we need to be a part of this conversation, and push to be in the room and have that conversation, because what you want to avoid is the PR team, if they are not more regularly working with you, them making a statement that maybe is more based on the executive's opinion or just what they feel like the world wants to hear versus what's authentic to what you're actually doing in the company. You know, we've seen it happen where the two aren't talking and the PR team internally will make a statement and a promise about what a community investment looks like. And you over here on the CSR side are like, what? We have to do what? So just push, be proactive and say, you know, we need to be a part of this conversation so we can be sure that what we're putting out there is authentic.
And I think there's like, is the statement get back to your mission?
Yeah.
I mean, is it important to you? Like, let's say, you know, like Roe v. Wade, like, you know, is it important for your organization to comment about this? And why, you know, if you're in the construction industry, no, probably not. But if you're in, women's health,
Yes.
maybe that's totally appropriate. So just thinking through that, just because you are upset about the issue, but does it get back to your core mission?
Yeah.
And your values?
Sometimes it's better to just not be in the mix for the sake
Yeah.
of being in the mix.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here and sharing all these tips and being at Be Civic today.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.